This is Radio Ecoshock with Alex Smith.
Ecoshock Radio for the world.
The ugly truth about long-haul COVID. This is Alex Smith from Radio Ecoshock with a special report. Perhaps you are ready to accept getting infected with COVID, now that it might be milder. Maybe you have already been infected, whether you know it or not. Either way, new scientific studies over tens of thousands of people reveal two harsh truths that I'm going to cover in this special. Number one, about 10% of people who get COVID continue to suffer from serious, sometimes life-threatening illness months and years later. Number two, those who recover from COVID are not immune to reinfection. You have less protection by far compared to a person recently jabbed with a booster vaccine. Instead of feeling protected after you get COVID, maybe you're thinking about partying or something, you should think of yourself as an immunocompromised person. You know, on your second bout, if you do get reinfected, it can be more damaging or fatal. After COVID, be more vigilant, not less. Get that message out to people, please. And I'm going to explain the science behind that in just a couple of minutes. The best hope, sold by the media and desperate authorities, goes like this. The new Omicron variant, it's mild. It's just like a bad cold or something. Omicron pushes out the more deadly variant and infects everyone, including all the unvaccinated. So that takes care of that problem because now they're immune, but they're not. Humanity emerges in the spring with just another nasty flu that comes back every year. That sounds livable. And maybe the politicians who toss out the restrictions to keep business going, well, maybe they're right. I mean, we might as well just keep on going and get our dose of COVID. Most people will be okay, we think. If you're happy with that, or if you are genuinely depressed, you may want to go away from this channel or get off of this podcast or tune to a different station on your radio. Because, I'm serious, in these times, we need to cling on to whatever gets us through the day, and if you're already feeling dark and very depressed, this is not the show for you because these are some tough facts to digest. The dream of mild Omicron accidentally saving humanity from a more deadly strain, it's possible, but is it likely? As every expert relentlessly says on TV, we don't know yet. It is still too soon to tell how the Omicron variant will play out in the real world, but definitely we know the continuing damage that variants like Delta have already inflicted on millions of people. The personal and economic costs are staggering now and will be in the months and years to come. The United States is a special case. First of all, the population was led into a dangerous myth, I think, not just by people pushing anti-science, but even by the government's Center for Disease Control. The CDC helped the hopeful narrative that kinder, gentler Omicron had pushed out Delta. In early December, the CDC reported that 73% of new cases were the Omicron variant. But on December 28th, the CDC made a major correction. Instead of 73% Omicron in the first 2 weeks of December, the true figure was 23%, a change of 50%. The majority of cases were deadly Delta. There were two pandemics at the same time. Deadly Delta has not in any way left the United States, Canada, or Europe. One review of cases, still not peer-reviewed, appears to show that having Omicron continues to prevent against getting Delta at the same time. Others argue that co-infection is certainly possible. We know for sure, especially from the experience in Israel, that Omicron can infect people even with 3 injections of the vaccines. The virus has mutated to escape vaccine resistance, but it looks like triple jab people still avoid the trip to intensive care or the morgue unless they were already near the edge due to other non-COVID conditions. Get this straight. There is no immunity by having COVID. Medical reports from several countries found people can be reinfected with COVID, getting it 2 or more times within a single year. Unlike some other famous diseases, surviving COVID does not create lifetime immunity or even immunity lasting a year. My personal conclusion is that people who have COVID-19 or any variant, whether symptomatic or not, should take more and not less protective measures. Cases on record show return COVID can be worse and more deadly than the first bout. Hopefully you can pass this message on to others. If someone got through COVID, it's not a get out of jail free card. It's time to be extra vigilant. And now, why is long-haul COVID almost hidden? The giant and most fearsome ogre in our time is not how many millions die from COVID, as deeply tragic as that is for those families. But the media mentions this other dark fear in passing. Maybe a couple of famous people admit it. We hear more cries from victims on Twitter. You know what I'm talking about. Long-haul COVID. Even in the pandemic, we heard of very low survival rates of people going on ventilators, like only 12% lived. And among those survivors, a minority of that minority experienced extreme impacts, like full-on dementia at any age. Others had to learn to speak and walk again, like a toddler. It's hard to find the statistics of people who now require dialysis for the rest of their lives because of their COVID infection. Kidney damage, heart damage, and brain damage emerged in COVID survivors, even those with mild symptoms at times. Others just lost their will to live, slipping into serious depression that lasts right up until today. Or they're tired, finding common ground with chronic fatigue syndrome, too tired to work, to look after their kids or themselves, to get their lives back. We do not know how long these symptoms will last. Organ damage to the kidneys and heart will not be repaired, of course, and they may be treated, but that person may die years younger than if they did not have COVID. When this pandemic is over, it will not be over. It seems likely millions of people will die due to COVID damage for years and decades after the disease, and we're going to find that in some new science that I'll tell you about. And most of those deaths will not be counted. That widespread damage will continue as long as variants like Delta find unvaccinated people. Given a big world with billions of humans, that could be decades, don't you think? We can't say for sure, but we know that the Omicron variant, can it cause the same kind of long-term impacts? I don't know that yet. With a virus barely a month old, it's too soon to say with any scientific or medical certainty. It looks like Omicron is having less severe impacts on most people who get it, which might reduce the continuing buildup of humans with long-haul COVID. That would be great if that's true. It's a good hope. I'm holding on to it. But we are getting the first explanations of how and when COVID-19 damages the heart, the brain, and other organs. Let's get straight to the breaking science on long-haul COVID. This was just released December 26th by the scientists at the U.S. National Institute of Health. These are rushed results from fresh autopsies of American COVID victims. This information comes with a warning. It is preprint and, quote, should not be considered conclusive, used to inform clinical practice, or referenced by the media as validated information, end quote. There's your warning. But due to the enormous need to understand this virus as it attacks society around the world, the NIH is breaking their normal slow procedure for peer-reviewed data and getting this out there. There are 33 authors, most of them prominent American medical scientists. The lead author is Dr. Daniel Chertow, investigator for the Emerging Pathogens section of the NIH. The manuscript is under review for the top journal Nature. The title is SARS-CoV-2 Infection and Persistence Throughout the Human Body and Brain. I post links to that paper in my show blog, published every Wednesday at ecoshock.org. Check that out. You can follow this up. Also, look for an article by Jason Gale at medscape.com. The headline is Coronavirus can persist for months after traversing the body. Jason writes, the coronavirus that causes COVID-19 can spread within days from the airways to the heart, the brain, and almost every other organ system in the body, where it may persist for months, a study found, end quote. Now, the best previous study on long-term effects was led by the director of the Clinical Epidemiology Center at the Veterans Affairs Hospital in St. Louis, Missouri, Dr. Ziad Al-Ali, and we will look at his paper shortly. But Ziad Al-Ali told Jason Gale, quote, for a long time now, we have been scratching our heads and asking why long COVID seems to affect so many organ systems. This paper sheds some light and may help explain why long COVID can occur even in people who had mild or asymptomatic acute disease, end quote. So, what did the NIH scientists find in the bodies of COVID victims? The COVID-19 RNA particles were found in the brain and in multiple parts of the body, lasting hundreds of days after symptoms began. The RNA that is the virus is still there, but can it be activated again? We don't know yet. But other viruses do have that capability, like the herpes virus, which hides in the body for years, erupting every now and then. We can't assume COVID-19 is like that, and we can't assume it isn't. But even more telling for millions of people experiencing illness and disability long after getting this coronavirus, the new NIH study suggests the way that spreading can take place. The investigators find the virus goes through an early stage in the first few days of infection, where it can explode out of the breathing system into the rest of the body. They're calling it a viremic phase. Take a deep breath. Not everyone experiences this all-body blast of virus. In fact, the majority of people do not. Yet a minority, say 1% of people who get COVID, it's a huge number of people when literally billions of people are infected with the virus around the world. In the UK's Guardian newspaper, December 23, disability activist J.D. Davids draws up these numbers for America. Quote, we now know that at least 10 to 30% of those who survive any COVID infection, from asymptomatic to mild to severe, will go on to live with, and sometimes die from, long COVID, a long-term, lifelong, and even life-threatening or fatal disabling chronic syndrome, the biological pathways of which are still largely unknown. Even before Omicron, the CDC estimates there have been at least 146.6 COVID infections in the United States alone, meaning at least 15 million people are estimated to have long COVID. That is from J.D. Davids in The Guardian. Find links in my show blog at ecoshock.org. That 15 million figure for people with long-haul COVID is lower than other estimates I have seen. It is just for the United States, of course, and it does not include whatever Omicron will leave in its wake in the year 2022 and beyond.
Radio Ecoshock.
This is Radio Ecoshock. I'm Alex Smith, host of the show for the last 15 years. I usually interview climate scientists, but this week we have a special about new understanding of one of the most feared aspects of this pandemic of the virus, long-haul COVID. I'm summarizing how science is coming out with new facts that we all need to know. Headline number 1 in this second section is COVID kills neurons in the brain. This is the awful truth found by the latest science. It is already known to doctors and nurses in many intensive care units around the world. In some people, COVID kills neurons in the brain, and they don't come back. This is confirmed in a paper published November 18, 2021, counting the neurological cost of COVID-19. A review of reports from 55 countries found 41 different neurological manifestations occurring with COVID-19. So the brain is so complex, damaging different parts of it reveals 41 different possible impacts reported so far. This is stunning. That means a lot of people are experiencing strange changes in their lives and may never realize it was COVID damage to the brain. The most extreme signs of brain damage from the virus are early onset dementia and Parkinson's disease. Although surviving, the person may require care for the rest of their shortened lives. Other symptoms seem less, but they still loom large, especially if it's you. Memory problems are common, words going missing, the brain breakdown formerly associated with advancing age, but now appearing in 30 to 50-year-olds and younger, even kids. Some people with COVID lose detectable and measurable IQ points due to neurons killed off by COVID in the brain. Quoting from Counting the Neurological Costs, a paper by Abdul Manan Baig, quote, differences in the prevalence of the various neurological symptoms were observed between older, aged 60 years or more, and younger, aged 18 or less, subpopulations. Acute confusion or delirium, fatigue, and myalgia tended to dominate in the older groups. In patients aged under 18 years, the most common neurological symptoms were impairment of smell and/or taste and headache, and seizures were also noted in some individuals. Alarmingly, mortality in patients with COVID-19 who had one or more neurological manifestations was found to be 27% and was especially high in patients aged 60 years or more. The finding that the prevalence of stroke was 1.2% in people with COVID-19 compared with only 0.2% in those with influenza is also concerning. End quote from the paper Counting the Neurological Cost by Abdul Manan Baig. Find that link in my blog at ecoshock.org. Statistically speaking, this COVID brain damage has probably not happened to you or your loved ones, but millions of people around you will be less able to work, to cope, to understand what is happening to them, and the people around them won't understand it either. Take this back of the envelope guesstimate from a tweeter who calls himself Abundant Pedestrian Sheds. Quote, let's do a bit more math. Let's say 70% get infected. 10% of that has long COVID. A UK study says 1 in 7. So 10% is a conservative enough estimate for the number who get long COVID. That'll give us roughly 23 million of people in the UK who will have apoptosis in the brain cells and long COVID. Plus, reinfections are twice as likely to be fatal. Just consider these tweets from Denise DeWald, an MD in Ohio. How is the economy going to look if the average age of dementia onset is 60 years rather than 84? There is a measurable decline in cognitive function in people who had just one episode of COVID. What happens after multiple bouts with the virus? Asks Denise. Back comes this comment. Meanwhile, China is protecting its citizens' workforce hardcore. How will we compete if our populace is profoundly affected cognitively in years to come? Another comment says, try from age 35. I am dealing with completely lost and confused people daily. We have already discussed discreetly screening those who have been infected when hiring. They are too great a burden for business when thinking fast on your feet is essential. End of that tweet. And how chilling is that? How many people will try to hide their COVID infection in their job resumes? How deep will the new discrimination go? A factor in marriage partners? For more information on brain damage and cognitive deficits after COVID, you can check out this paper published July 22nd, 2021. The title is Cognitive Deficits in People Who Have Recovered from COVID-19. That was published in the journal The Lancet. Another study published in The Lancet April 6, 2021, in a huge UK study of medical records, found 1 in 3 COVID patients developed either neurological or psychiatric problems in the first 6 months after the infection. Damage ranges from nervous disorders to depression to paranoia and beyond, perhaps antisocial behavior. It can appear in COVID patients of all ages. That includes children, parents, and grandchildren. I don't have time in this show to go into the psychiatric changes after COVID-19. But remember, that hits just a few. But in this game, a few is a lot, too many to count. As mentioned, Dr. Ziad Al-Ali published an important paper on long-haul COVID in April 2021. He is senior author of the study and a director of clinical epidemiology at the Veterans Affairs in St. Louis. In a news release from Washington University in St. Louis, Al-Ali said, quote, "Our study demonstrates that up to 6 months after diagnosis, the risk of death following even a mild case of COVID-19 is not trivial and increases with disease severity. Given that more than 30 million Americans have been infected with the virus, and given that the burden of long COVID-19 is substantial, the lingering effects of this disease will reverberate for many years and even decades." Al-Ali also warned that our current death tolls in every country is just the beginning. Quote, "As far as total pandemic death toll, these numbers suggest that the deaths we're counting due to the immediate viral infection are only the tip of the iceberg." As the WUSTL press release explains, quote, "For the Nature study, researchers examined more than 87,000 COVID-19 patients and nearly 5 million control patients in a federal database. They found COVID-19 patients had a 59% higher risk of death up to 6 months after infection compared to non-infected people. These findings translate into about an 8 extra deaths per 1,000 patients over 6 months, because many deaths caused by long-term COVID complications are not recorded as COVID-19 deaths, the researchers said." End quote. In this meta-study of about 74,000 patient records held by the Veterans Administration, Al-Ali found that COVID-19 can result in, get ready for this list, it's a terrible list: respiratory system, persistent cough, shortness of breath, low oxygen levels in the blood; nervous system, stroke, headaches, memory, problems with senses of taste and smell; mental health, anxiety, depression, sleep, substance abuse; metabolism, new onset of diabetes, obesity, and high cholesterol; cardiovascular system, acute coronary disease, heart failure, heart palpitations and irregular heart rhythms; gastrointestinal system, constipation, diarrhea, and acid reflux; kidney, acute kidney injury, and chronic kidney disease that can, in severe cases, require dialysis; coagulation regulation, blood clots in the legs and lungs; skin, rash and hair loss; musculoskeletal system, joint pain and muscle weakness; general malaise, fatigue, and anemia. So that's a terrible list coming from a scientific study. There's really no debating it. It's done from the study in the United States of people who have had COVID and people who have died from it. The statistics are sound. So if you are worried that you have had long-haul COVID, or that you need to support someone else who does, here's a resource for you. It's called the Survivor Corps, a grassroots group at www.survivorcorps.com, and of course, Corps is spelled CORPS. What about the massive risk of Omicron evolving into a new variant? One awful truth to get through here: the historic infection of billions of people worldwide in a few months greatly increases the odds of a new and worse variant of COVID will develop and escape. Even if this one is milder, which we don't know yet, the worldwide virus factory growing in so many people is another darkening cloud on the time horizon. We have to be ready if we can be. Early in the pandemic, immunologists explained a new COVID variant could develop within a single person. Each person with the virus has billions of copies in it. Medical scientists suggest that someone who survives a long time while sick with one COVID variant is a possible bioreactor where a new variant can form. Actually, every person with COVID becomes a new bioreactor, an experimental chamber for the virus to try countless new variations. It only requires one even more successful variation to reconquer the human herd and a lot of other mammals. And by the way, a third of the deer tested in Ohio were positive for COVID-19. Whatever strain the deer have is probably going to be endemic wherever the deer are found, and they don't have herd immunity either. If you want to collect up all your COVID fears and put them on the table, just don't forget the massively increased risk of new variants as uncontrolled Omicron and the remains of Delta blow up disease records around the world. As good doctors like Peter Hotez and Eric Fagelding continually warn, the more cases we have, the more chance of dangerous variants developing, perhaps to escape any vaccine or treatment we have now. The greatest wave of disease ever seen on Earth carries the seed possibility of even worse to come, or not. Remember, the first SARS-1, far more lethal than SARS-2, which we call COVID-19, it evolved away from human hosts. A vaccine for SARS-1 was developed, but was never used because the new variation just disappeared from human experience. It was a warning shot. A small group of virus experts, and eventually even Bill Gates, got the message. Sadly, governments and the public did not, and here we are. But if this is our darkest hour, remember, the virus has no planning intelligence. It changes through billions of trials by brute force, by the force of numbers, to see what could succeed better. We have failed to fight off this virus, but the virus can fail too. That weak hope remains. Whether Omicron saves us from more deadly Delta, or new treatments do appear for acute illness during 2022, we can be sure that the impacts of this viral event will last for decades. Millions of people have already lost key functions with damage in organs and reduced energy to live their full lives. Their lifespans could be shorter. Even the average life expectancy could be reduced, including in developed countries. This pandemic is going to require something else that has been in short supply this last decade, and that is caring for others, including people who look or speak differently. In history, I guess we could say religion stepped in to provide emotional or spiritual support for those in need. Charity is built into Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. But all three religions are declining in the age of science and modernity. Will the frightened people return to religion? Are we going to see a big revival here? And I guess we still need charity, but we need something else. We need a fair society to survive this and to survive any other coming threats coming our way. The situation requires a new social mechanism, don't you think, where the survivors care for the wounded. This includes hundreds of thousands of kids who lost their parents, the new COVID orphans. It includes the bright college professor who lost the IQ needed to keep on teaching, or the Amazon worker from the warehouse who's now stuck in bed home without support or benefits. It means even the Indian farmer who can't support the family, just too sick and too tired. Millions of the COVID injured now need help from the survivors. This is our challenge, and it comes in a time when selling hate and division is so profitable. Can the pandemic finally bring out the best in us? Anything is possible. I'm Alex Smith. You can find links to all the science and news I just talked about in my show blog published every Wednesday at ecoshock.org, and there's a free downloadable MP3 file of this as well. Thank you for listening and watching. I'm Alex Smith. Goodbye for now.